coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to the Wisdom Speaks Podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Lanico Cash. Join me here every week as I challenge our culture's very common misconceptions about faith and address the concepts of faith that have been deemed unacceptable and displeasing to God. I'm so glad you're joining me today. Imagine being in a place of being afraid of failure, setting goals and expectations so high that you reject your own mere efforts at success, feeling as if nothing you do is good enough or perfect. In a place where you're focusing only on results, that you become deathly afraid to fail, becoming paralyzed and immobilized, failing to move altogether because you're worried about doing something imperfectly. In a place where you can't even allow uncomfortable or negative, quote unquote, emotions. You can't even allow your own uncomfortable emotions. You can't even allow the uncomfortable emotions of others around you out of a fear of feeling judged by people. If this is you, if any of this is you, I want you to walk with me because today I want to talk about a subject topic that we don't spend a lot of time, and for some of us, we don't spend any time at all talking about it. I want to spend some time talking about a subject that gets put inside of a closet, that gets buried in a box under a rug where no one can see it. But most of us experience it. And sometimes we don't even know that we're experiencing it. I want to talk about and deal with shame. Yeah. And our vulnerabilities that are connected to that shame. So go with me today. So I know you are probably wondering why I have mentioned the word perfection so much in a subject that is titled shame. And many of you may not know this, but perfectionism is directly connected to shame. Perfectionism, in fact, is the vehicle that drives shame. And I want to dig into that and I want to delve into that because this is something, again, that I know that a lot of us don't really even understand what might be happening in our lives. And so I want to talk about it. I want to open the door for this conversation today, this very much needed conversation today. So let's start here. Let's start with talking about what shame is. What is shame? And shame describes feelings of inadequacy that are created by internalized conversations. And those conversations that we internalize tend to be negative self-beliefs and center around negative self-beliefs and negative things that we believe about ourselves. And then what happens as a result of that inadequacy that we feel, then our personal insecurities, our secrets, the things we don't tell people, our mistakes that we have made and may have made in the past, and even what we perceive to be flaws about ourselves. All of that becomes things that just further drive this vehicle of shame in our lives. And I want to stop here. I want to pause here. And I must put this in right here because I want to encourage you that if some of this of what I've already talked about hits you and you've experienced it, I want to encourage you here that it's not completely your fault. It's not completely your fault. Why? Because where does shame come from? Shame comes from us living in a culture that would rather hide away, rather than live in truth. I'm going to say that again. The shame comes from us living in a culture that would rather hide rather than live in truth. Our culture would rather hide away its shame and feelings of shame. Our culture would rather hide away in our imperfections. Our culture would rather hide in its flaws, in the things that make us human, in our shortcomings, and in our vulnerabilities. We live in a culture that would rather hide away in those things rather than just live outside of the closet in truth, in the truth that we are human, in the truth that not everything is perfect. And let me say this too. I know that we are used to thinking about shame in the sense of shame being an emotion that results from something that we have done wrong. Because I even looked up the definition of shame. And shame, as it is defined by Google and by a lot of other dictionary sites, basically talks about shame as it relates to us doing something wrong and then the emotion that follows that, where we feel bad about it. We feel bad about something that we've done. But I want to talk about shame today from a slightly different perspective. And this perspective that I want to touch on, again, it's a perspective that we don't talk about a lot. We don't spend a lot of time talking about it. But I want to open the door to this conversation today. And I want to talk about the shame from the perspective of making us feel inadequate, that is created by what we internalize, the negative self-beliefs that we internalize about ourselves. And again, it's not completely our fault, because we live in a culture that perpetuates that everything and makes us believe that everything ought to be perfect. Everything ought to look perfect. Everything ought to appear to the eye, to other people, as being perfect and straight up. We live in a culture that makes us believe that that makes us feel bad when everything does not go perfectly. And we live in a culture that would rather deal with that would rather hide away our own flaws and our own imperfections, and then make others feel bad about their imperfections, and in turn make them to hide away as well. This is a serious thing. But let me tell you something. I want to share probably for many people, this will be a little known fact. Some people may not even know this and may not even understand or recognize this at all. But I want to share a little known fact with you as part of this encouragement. So, from the field of health psychology, and what made me look here is because I'm a preacher, yes, an ordained minister, yes, but I also am a mental health therapist, and I've worked in that field for quite some time. And so, from the field of health psychology, there have been studies that have been done, and these studies show that perceived vulnerability, which is simply meaning the ability to acknowledge that you are at risk of vulnerability, the ability to accept and to actually speak and acknowledge that you have vulnerabilities. So studies have shown that perceived vulnerability and the act of sharing them, with other people, greatly increases your chances of adhering to some kind of positive health regimen. So in other words, the audacity and the courage to share what makes you vulnerable, to share your imperfections. Studies have shown that in the practice of sharing that, you greatly increase your chances of taking good care of yourself. Imagine that. And it makes perfect sense. If you think about it, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because when you are carrying the heavy weight of perfectionism, wanting to be perfect, wanting every circumstance and every situation and every idea of yours to be perfect, to fit perfectly in people's minds. When you are living under the weight of that, trust me, because I know personally, I know how that feels. And I'm going to share a bit of that in a bit. But living under the weight of that is heavy. But when you throw that thing off, when you throw that weight off of you and take that weight off of you, man, my God, you live lighter. You live lighter on your feet. You live in a way that is not hindered. You live free, dare I say. And so this makes total sense about these studies that show that when you actually have the courage and the audacity to share your vulnerabilities and to acknowledge them, that actually puts you at a gives you greater chances to take good care of yourself. Could you imagine some of the habits that are formed from living in a closet, from living under the weight of because you are not perfect, and because because you fear that you don't look perfect in the eyes of others? Can you imagine the habits that could be formed? Too many to name here. And so, but I wanted to share that because that's important to know when we're talking about the subject of shame. And I really want to, again, go back to this connection that is between perfectionism. Because as a recovered perfectionist myself, I know the weight that is possible to live under. And it's heavy. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. And let me say this too, that when you live like this, you are reaching for a goal line that you will never meet, because perfection is an illusion. It's not real, and it's not anything that we can tangibly touch and be at. And so it's exhausting. It's exhausting. So I want to try to move. I want to, in this moment now, I just want to open up our senses, and I want to awaken our senses, because I know that when you live in this state, it shuts you down because you spend so much time having to hide away the emotions that you feel and the vulnerabilities that you carry. You spend so much time, and that can almost deaden your senses. But I want to, in this moment, awaken our senses. Because I want to share with you how shame feels. So how does shame feel? It feels vulnerable. It feels very vulnerable. How else does shame feel? It feels like triggers. Again, working in the mental health field, it is our aim to help. One of the goals that we have for people is to help them to recognize the triggers, things that trigger them to run away, what triggers you to go and hide away in a closet, what triggers you to want to avoid. That's our goal as mental health therapists and mental health specialists, is to help people to understand what those triggers are. And so shame feels like triggers. It feels like when something is something that will trigger you to run away or trigger you to hide away. Shame also feels like weakness. It feels like a perceived weakness. Like, nah, I can't let nobody know how that I'm really feeling, that my heart is in this right now. Shame also feels like embarrassment. It feels like humiliation. And then, worst of all, shame can feel imperfect. It can feel like imperfection. Like, oh my God, you actually have something that makes you human, that makes you imperfect. But that's what shame can feel like. What does shame sound like? What does it sound like? It sounds like this: I should be okay. I should be okay. But the reality is, I can't let anyone know that I'm actually not okay. I can't do anything well. I can't do anything right. I can't ever get anything right or perfect. That word, I can't. I'm lazy. I'm not doing enough. So I've got to push myself to do more because I should be doing more than I'm doing. So I'm being lazy. That's what shame feels like. Shame also, or I'm sorry, well, that's what shame sounds like. And shame also sounds like this. I must not be good enough for this. I may not be getting it right because maybe I'm not good enough for this. Maybe I'm not good enough to go after this job. Maybe I'm not good enough to start this ministry. Maybe I'm not good enough to create this content. Maybe I'm not good enough for this relationship. Maybe I wasn't good enough for someone to treat me well. That's what shame sounds like. And again, I really want you to locate yourself if this is where you are and if you've ever felt anything like this. Because here is where I'm going to jump in to the conversation. I want to share a vulnerability with you today. And for many of you who listen to my podcast and who listen to my ministry and who follow my ministry, know this about me. So many of you won't know this, but I am a mother of 2 angel babies, which means that I have lost 2 children to death. And for the sake of time and for the sake of the space that we're in, believe me, they are 2 completely different experiences, which each hold equally their own weight in their own right. But for the sake of this particular conversation, I'm going to go with my very first loss, which was my very first pregnancy. And I want to talk about my son. And this is why I burned this candle behind me that has a J on it. This is to have me to understand and to know that my son is always with me, regardless. And so I want to talk about that. I want to share that with you today. So Jalen was my first pregnancy. When my husband and I first found out that we were pregnant, we were excited. We were elated. We were over the moon, right? And so we began eventually to share the news, just like every woman does at some point, whenever she feels comfortable. And so we began to share the news with everyone. And we also began to, tell people and allow people to, be there for us and to share their own emotions and feelings with us as well. So we're walking through the pregnancy. And this is my very first pregnancy. I had never been pregnant before. And I had never had anyone to tell me or to share with me the serious nature of pregnancy and what kinds of things that I should be on the lookout for, what kinds of things I should be doing, what kinds of things I should be staying away from, and so forth and so on. I didn't have anyone to tell me those things or to share with me how serious pregnancy is and what and how much commitment it really does take. And so yet and still, here I am. We're walking through the pregnancy as normal. Well, the pregnancy is perfect. It is the most ideal pregnancy you can think of. No problems, no complications, nothing to think about other than my next appointment. And so we get up to 40 weeks. Right at the end, at 40 weeks, the baby was not ready to come. He was not ready to come. So we waited. And then once we crossed over to 41, we waited some more. He still wasn't ready to come. And so one day we decided that it was best for us to go and get checked to make sure that everything was okay, because I just was on extra watch by this point. And we just wanted to make sure that everything was okay. And we get to the hospital, and that is where we are given the news that our baby boy had died. Yeah, he died in utero. And so here I was having to deliver a baby sleeping. And it was, of course, as you can only imagine, the most devastating experience I've ever to date experienced. And so I did my time. We stayed in the hospital, and they allowed the baby to stay with us until my hospital stay was over. But when I got home is when my husband and I's grief journey began. And I can remember initially at the beginning of our grief journey, I can remember there was one emotion out of all the emotions that I felt, because of course this was my first time ever. I'd never experienced anything like this. My husband, neither. And so everything was brand spanking new. All the feelings, all the emotions, but out of all the emotions that I felt, I can remember distinctly one emotion in particular that was overwhelmingly in abundance over all the other emotions. And at the time, I couldn't quite understand because again, this was brand new to me, all of this was. And so I couldn't really articulate the things that I'm able to articulate now. But now that I know, and now that I have the tools, it's different. And I can explain, I know exactly what it was. And so that emotion that was so overwhelming and overpowering over everything else was the feeling of embarrassment. And I didn't know any of what I know now, but all I knew then was that it felt embarrassing. It felt humiliating where I was in the place that I was, coming home with no baby to show for the 40 plus weeks that I carried my son. And so that was very devastating to feel such embarrassment. The only thing, and if I had to try to give you a visual, because I'm a visual person, and if I had to try and attempt to give you a visual, this is how it felt. Imagine being in a football game. And the game is a good game. I mean, it's going back and forth, back and forth. You just don't know who's going to win. And the score keeps changing amongst the teams, right? So you go all the way to the end of the game. And by the time that the end of the game comes, the score is tied. And then that takes you into overtime. And so then I'm in overtime. And this is the very last play of the game. And I get the ball. And when I get the ball, I fumble the ball so badly. And I fumble and cost the team the loss. And I lose the game for myself and for everyone else. So now everyone who has come to this stadium hoping in hopes that this game would come and turn in their favor have to now leave the stadium disappointed and mad and upset because the game was lost. That is how it felt. That fumble is what it felt like. And so I had to deal with that. And that was really, really difficult. And I felt so embarrassed. And I didn't understand because that feeling persisted over and over for so long. But before eventually, eventually, with therapy, with groups, with support groups, and with all the, tools, gaining more tools and gaining more language as time went on, I was able to gain more language for what I was feeling and what was going on. And I started to begin to understand what was really happening in that period of time, because that sent me into a place, that embarrassing, humiliating feeling sent me to a place that kept me basically in a closet for a long time. And I didn't understand why. But then, like I said, once I gained some tools and acquired some more skills and some tools to deal and to cope, I understood what was really going on. And what was really going on at this time was that there was feelings of shame that I was carrying. And here we are, watch this, because here's that connection again. I was such a perfectionist, and I believe in everything having to be perfect, having to feel perfect, having to look perfect, having to go perfect. And because of the way that we position ourselves in our society to make people think and make everyone think that everything ought to be perfect, that everything ought to go perfect. When you get pregnant, you're supposed to, naively, I thought, you're supposed to, when you get pregnant, wait exactly 9 months and then you're coming home with a baby happily ever after. When you get married, you're supposed to stay married and be happily ever after. These are the things that we make people believe ought to go perfectly. And so when that pregnancy did not end perfectly, That was what I felt the weight of. I felt the weight of the perfectionist in me that sought perfection. And when I didn't get perfection, I was deathly disappointed and devastated to the point where it ran me into the ground and ran me into a closet. And that was what was happening. So that feeling, and that's how I know how shame feels. That's how I know that it feels embarrassing. It feels humiliating. When you do things, you're expecting it to turn out perfectly, but when it doesn't, our society, our culture makes us believe that there is something wrong with us or that we've done something wrong. Instead of helping us to be empathetic toward one another, helping us to understand that life is not perfect. Every circumstance and situation does not go perfectly. That's not even the nature of the type of world and the fallen world we live in. That's the result of living in a fallen world, is that everything will not be perfect. And so I'm sharing this today. I share this with you today. One, because I'm healed enough to be able to express this, but also in hopes that you will seek God for your healing and you will seek God for restoration, in believing that this is not completely your fault. That things that happen, the imperfections that make you who you are and make you human and make you able to empathize with other humans, is totally natural. That's what is natural, not hiding away in it. And so I thought I just wanted to share that with you. So I want to lift up right now, whatever you, and I'm talking to you, yes, you, who may be living under that weight, who may be currently living under that weight of feeling like you are imperfect and feeling like your flaws, the things that make you who you are and make you human. I want to encourage you, that's actually your superpower. Being able to empathize, being able to acknowledge your perceived vulnerabilities, that, my friend, is your superpower. And I hope you hear that today. And so I just want to encourage you. I want to leave you with this encouragement. If you have found yourself living under the weight of shame and also living as a result of perfectionism, as a result of expecting everything in life to be perfect when it's not, and it won't ever be. Things will happen. Circumstances will change. People will change. But that's a part of the fallen world we live in. And so I want to leave you with this encouragement. I want to read you a love letter, is what I'll call it. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, says Jesus. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. These are words that Jesus used, and it's found in Matthew chapter 11. But these are words that Jesus used in order to provide great comfort to those who were just plain exhausted. Exhausted from the expectation from life, from the expectation of life. And perfectionism and the shame that comes out of it, it's exhausting. And so these are words that Jesus uses to provide great comfort to those of us who are exhausted. And I want you to understand that today and know that God does not desire for you, beloved. He doesn't desire for you to be striving so hard to achieve something that you'll never attain, and that's perfection. What he wants is to be able to provide you with rest. And you don't need to carry such a heavy burden by yourself. You, yes, you who are living under that weight of shame that is produced as a result of perfectionism. You don't need to carry such a heavy burden by yourself. Jesus will carry it for you. In fact, he will do all of the heavy lifting for you. And he'll do that so that you aren't weighed down by the pursuit of perfection. Because it can be exhausting. Take it from me. I know, as a person who knows this well and who has known this before, rather. Praise be to God for deliverance. But I encourage you today to not set your goals and expectations so high that you reject your own mere efforts and you don't even realize the steps you're actually taking toward your success because you feel as nothing is good enough. I urge you and I pray for you today that you will allow that weight to be lifted. Allow God to lift that weight off of you so that you may live lighter and so that you may be able to be a beacon for others and be empathetic toward others, showing people how human they really are. And this is my prayer. And until next time, that's it, y'all. And that ends this hour of the Wisdom Speaks podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and to leave me a review on our Facebook page, as well as share this episode with a friend. You may reach me with any questions or comments at thewisdomspeakspodcast@gmail.com. Connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, and on YouTube. If you would like to support this podcast, which would be very much appreciated, you can certainly do so by way of my website, CashApp, Venmo, or by becoming a member of my Patreon, all searchable under the Wisdom Speaks Podcast. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great week.